Shabbat Shalom!
Shabbat Shalom!
There we go. Welcome back once again. Great to see everybody that we have here. For our online viewers that can see me, but I can't see you, that's a little creepy, but hello and welcome to you as well. So we're continuing our study today with Paul's letter to the Galatians. You'll recall from last week, I hope, unless you missed last week, in which case you should get caught up on YouTube. We started chapter 4. Right? We're a couple months in, and we've just started chapter 4. There's only 6 chapters, right? So we're going okay. I think we're doing all right. But we covered verses 1 through 5, wherein Paul continues to build on his metaphor of a child growing into maturity, right? Of us, because that's who he's talking about, as believers. Right? And in fact, I would say more often than we perhaps think, we actually are very much like the Galatians. I've tried to relate that to various ways that Paul delivers a certain message. He makes a certain point. He says something in this letter. And it's easy for us to feel disconnected. It's easy for us to think, well, that was a first century group of low-class barbarians. Right? I mean, it's Gauls. Right? I'm not trying to be insulting, but that was their culture. And actually, that's commonly how they were viewed by the Romans. Right? This area of people, southern Galatia, you can see the introduction for that whole debate. But southern Galatia, well, these are lesser people. In fact, in one of his comments, Paul talks about Greeks or barbarians, most Bibles will translate it, right? Because the Greek was supposed to be the member of high society, the educated, the evolved man, right? The barbarian, those were the ones that didn't accept our Hellenistic ways. Those are the ones that didn't want to become educated philosophers and members of high society. They're lesser than. And Paul is actually very keen on drawing those parallels between social classes where you think, oh, I'm up here and you're down there. He's very keen on pointing those out to tell you that they really don't matter. We went through that at the end of Galatians, right? Slave and free, Jew and Greek, male and female, neither of those have anything to do with your standing in God's eyes. Because in the eyes of society, and the rulers of society, those things had everything to do with who you were, what you were allowed to do, what you were allowed to be. But we can easily see ourselves in Galatians. It's easy to see how we could get disconnected from it. But it should be especially in the Messianic Hebraic, Torah observant, Torah pursuant, I could come up with a few other terms, but whatever, movement. It should be especially easy to see why Galatians is relevant, why it's necessary, because I've seen it many times. I've spent my entire life in this walk. I have seen it many times of people getting pulled away and taken off course by some sort of new thing, some sort of teaching that comes in that usurps the core truth of the gospel. We'll talk about that a little bit today as well. So we, because we are like the Galatians in so many ways, we have guardians and managers. We read Paul saying last week, guardians and managers, words that he uses in reference to the ones who guide us, teach us, and sometimes discipline us, not always in a good way, but nevertheless that are to be credited in some shape, form, or fashion of why we have landed where we have. Now, the reason that we have these guardians, these managers, and in addition to that, the Torah as our pedagogos, right? Our guardian, you could say guardian, pedagogue, your schoolmaster, older translations used to render it, has the ultimate goal of bringing us to Messiah. All of this should be working together to bring us to Messiah. The same way that Paul says in his letter to the Romans that Messiah is the goal of the Torah. Why should you live out the Torah to the best of your ability? Because in doing so, you should look like Yeshua. Because if you treat people the way that God wants you to treat them, if you honor and worship the Lord the way that He wants you to do so, you'll be doing it according to God's own instructions, and in doing so, you should be emulating the Messiah. So first off, we're going to reread verses 4 and 5 from last week. That way we can sort of bridge to today's topic. So Galatians 4:4. He said, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent out His Son, born of a woman and born under law, to free those under law so we might receive adoption as sons." We looked at some of the reasons, in my opinion, that the timing of Yeshua's coming was perfect. The fullness of time, we say. We also examined how Paul used this phrase, the fullness of time, right? The appointed time, we could say, the correct, perfect time. He uses this phrase in conjunction with his reference to the stoicheia, right? The elemental spirits, as sort of a rebuke to the idea that these spirits had control over nature. And we're actually going to spend quite a bit more time on the stoicheia and the related concept today. Nevertheless, Paul likens Yeshua to us in that he was born of a natural human birth. Right? He was born under law. He experienced what we experience. He experienced pain. He experienced sadness. He experienced joy. And the gospel writers are very keen on pointing out that he did all of these things, just like he ate and drank, just like he was killed and buried and rose again. So he was born under law, Paul says. He was subjected to it, just like we are. The point here isn't that he was exempted from it, even though he never broke it. He was still subjected to it. Verse 5 says the reason for Yeshua's coming, his mission was to free those, quote, under law. This here, again, is a reference to being subject to it. As Paul noted previously in Galatians 3:13, Messiah died to free us not from the obligation to keep the Torah, but to free us from the curse of the law. This is what Paul is building on. Not that the Torah is a curse, but that the Torah carries one. This curse, this condemnation, is what Paul means here by us being under law. Yeshua became a curse to free us from the curse. He came under law to free those under law. Right? These are his own words from his own letter. This is not some traditional reading or interpretation we insert where and what he means in terms of law, but by using his own teaching, his own context to define what he means. And to what end? Why did Yeshua endure the pain of death and an excruciating crucifixion at that? To free us so that once freed, we might receive the adoption as sons and daughters of God. Sin and death kept us out of the covenant, away from God's promise to Abraham. But through Yeshua's completed work, we are adopted into the family of Abraham, into the family of God. Amen. Amen. So now we'll continue with our reading for today. First, the whole section of verses. We'll be reading verses 6 through 11, and then we'll go back through it in smaller pieces. Okay? So Galatians 4, starting at verse 6. Now because you are sons, God sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts, who cries out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, also an heir through God. But at that time, when you did not know God, you served those who by nature are not gods at all. But now you have come to know God, or rather you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back again to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Now there's a lot here, right? It's exciting, isn't it? You ready? There's probably honestly more here than you realize. And I think by the end of our time today, you will agree that there's more here than you first realized. As you've probably noticed, I don't like proof texting my way through the Bible. I don't like reading a few verses in English, explaining my thoughts and how it makes me feel, and then moving on. I don't like trying to ignore or explain away the difficult words and passages. I've done that in the past. I think at some point we all have. There are many such teachers out there that do just that. Many Torah observant ones as well. Many that will only quote Galatians or Romans or maybe Hebrews or Ephesians when they want to take a few verses out of a certain chapter to prove a point, but never to spend time studying and teaching through the text in its own context and setting. And it's part of why we started this series, because multiple people have asked for it. The reason being, there is not much solid material on this book, covering this book in our movement, unfortunately. To some degree, it's understandable, but it's unfortunate. But enough of that for now. So let's dive a bit deeper, starting with verses 6 and 7 again. He says, Now because you are sons, God sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts, who cries out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, also an heir through God. Because you, here again, he's speaking directly to his non-Jewish audience, right? Because it's easy if Paul says, because we are sons, right? Because everyone would say, well, you're the Jewish people. Of course you're the children of God. But he says you, because you, he's being intentional here. And actually you see that a lot in Galatians if you start paying attention to when he switches between we and us and you and your. He's very intentional in his letters about that. So that was, after all, the issue of this entire letter, right? That one must become Jewish in order to be a child of Abraham. That's what these Galatians were being taught. Because of the adoption, because God has accepted us as children, Paul says he sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts. Right? So what does the verse say? Because you are sons, God sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts. Right? Once again, that's intentional. Crying out, Abba, Father. This indwelling of the Ruach here is introduced with the adverbial causal conjunction. That's not going to mean anything to most people. But it's the Greek word hoti. Hoti, it means for or because or on account of. Right? That is, it here supplies the reason for something. Here Paul notes, because you are children of God, he has sent the Spirit into our hearts. Now again, this is an interesting transition from you are sons to our hearts. I don't think he's saying that he's only included because the Galatians got adopted, right? Rather, the point is you are already children. And then he adds himself in there to say, hey, I received it too, you received it too, we're part of the same body. It's also interesting to note that in Romans 8, he has similar things to say. In Romans 8:9, he says, however, you are not in the flesh, but in the Ruach, if indeed the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, he does not belong to him. This sort of almost interchangeable language, Spirit of God and Spirit of Messiah. Further in Romans 8, starting at verse 14, for all who are led by the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall again into fear. Rather, you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Here, Paul does not include this causal adverbial conjunction, hoti, as he did in Galatians. But perhaps that's making more of the grammar than we really should. We must be careful not to put too much of our argument onto the weight of a word he didn't use, right? It kind of puts us into speculative territory. However, the order he uses in Romans almost seems backwards, doesn't it? Those led by the Spirit, they become children of God, right? So we can ask, which one comes first? You get the Spirit and then become a child of God. You become a child of God and then get the Spirit. See, I think because of our man-made theological systems, we've made a bit of a mess of this. I think it's more likely, not that Paul's theology changed from when he wrote Galatians, as in, you're a child and you get the Spirit. And then later on he changed his mind in Romans and said, you get the Spirit, that makes you a child. Right? Rather, I think he saw them as intertwined. Why do you receive the promised Spirit? Because you're God's child, and he loves you. What makes you God's child? What is the mechanism of adoption? You receive the promised Spirit. You see that? You have to have both. Both go together. We do a disservice, I think, when trying to separate the two. Lastly, you see here in verse 15, we have again the language of adoption and crying out, Abba, Father. But here, Paul says we cry out by or through or in the Spirit, but we cry out, right? By which we cry out. But in Galatians 4:6, now because you are sons, God sent the Ruach of his Son into our hearts, who cries out, Abba, Father. Notice here, it is not the adopted children with the Ruach dwelling in us that cry out, but rather it is the Spirit that cries out. So how do we square these? All right, and this is different things. Does the Spirit cry out? Do we cry out? Once again, I think it's pretty simple. As you will hopefully recall from the Fruit of the Spirit series, the Ruach doesn't possess you to force you to do good things. Okay? You don't become a puppet and then you have no control of yourself and you just wake up one day after having done these great Spirit-inspired things. That's not how it works. The Spirit dwells within us and empowers us and guides us to do the things that God expects us to do. So it is not the Spirit in me being loving and joyful and peaceful and I have nothing to do with it, right? Like I have no power, I have no control, I have no choice, I have no design. It is me empowered by the Spirit, right? Think of it like taking a trip. You get in your car and you're going to drive from New York to Miami. That's all well and good, but you have no gas. You're not going anywhere, right? You have most of the pieces, but you need the fuel to make it. Once the fuel has been added, you can make the trip. You couldn't have done it without it, but you still drove. So the Ruach in us does drive us, but not force us to cry out, Abba, Father. It's not us crying out or the Spirit crying out. We have to get out of this binary category. We want to put all of our theological positions in. It's that one or it's that one. It's usually not, right? It's not grace or works. We need both. But it's about the priority and the precedence of them. Grace, we need first and foremost because all of our works won't be enough. However, because God is merciful and gracious, we are expected to grow and produce good fruit, the result of good works. We don't need to set up this dichotomy of I have this one versus that one. Okay? So here it is as well. It is not either the Spirit cries out or we do. We are driven by the Spirit to cry out. At least we should be, right? It's both and, not either or. Now, two additional things to examine here in verse 6. The first is crying out. What sort of crying out is this? Right? What does this really mean? Why does the Spirit within us or the Spirit cause us to cry out? Is it similar to calling up the stairs and telling kids it's time for dinner? Time for dinner. Right? Is this the sort of crying out you do when you see a friend and out in public about to get into their car and you want to get their attention to say hi for a minute? Hey, Jim! Is it the sort of crying out? What sort of cry is this? Here's a Greek lesson for you for today. I like the Greek lessons myself. Kradzo. Kradzo, to cry out, call, shout. That's the word in question here. It's a very versatile word. It's kind of like we looked at last week with stoicheia. The upside is that we have a lot of information about this word and its usage. A lot. The downside is we have a lot of information about this word and its usage, meaning it can be much more difficult to determine exactly how it's being used. Right? When you have a word that's only ever used to mean one thing, it's pretty simple to figure out what Paul meant there. When you have a word that can mean a whole bunch of different things, and his context could show him using it in multiple different ways, it makes it a little bit more challenging. I would say fun, if you're interested in the study. That's why we need some additional context clues, some additional background to help us understand why Paul is using the word the way that he is here. The word is found over 50 times in the New Testament, but only 3 times does Paul use it, which is surprising considering, basically half of the New Testament bears his name. Twice we have already read, once here in Galatians in our passage and once in Romans 8. The other time is in Romans 9 when Paul refers to Isaiah crying out in reference to one of his prophecies. Okay? So the purpose of the cry in this instance is one of necessity, almost desperation. Not simply calling to get attention, but really, truly crying out of desperation. This can be seen in Matthew 27:50. And Yeshua cried out again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. When you are dying the most painful death you can imagine, your cry is not one of, hey, Jim. Right? This verse should express the sense of what Paul has in mind when he says that the Ruach causes us to cry out. Okay? Now, given this and his use of both the Greek pater and the Aramaic Abba, I think it is likely that Paul is here relating this crying out to the way Yeshua did, but also to the way that Yeshua spoke of his relationship with the Father, which brings us to our second point. Abba HaPater. Why do you say it twice? Abba, that is Aramaic. That's not a Greek word. It's just Greek letters writing an Aramaic word. And pater, that is a Greek word. Now, my Aramaic primicists will say this is because Paul wrote in Aramaic and a Greek translator later added the Greek word, and that's just silly. It makes no sense. But that is not the case. Paul intentionally used both terms. Pater, because that is the Greek word. It's used over 400 times in the New Testament. It's used over 1,000 times in the Septuagint. Did you know that? The Greek word for father occurs over 1,000. That's crazy. It's a common word that anyone in that day would have known. And they would have understood how he meant it. Father, very simple. But why Abba? Why add in this Aramaic word in there as well? Especially to the Greek-speaking Galatians. Doesn't it mean the same thing? Well, first, let me tell you this. The phrase, as we have it here, Abba HaPater, is found in 3 places in the New Testament exactly like this. Twice we've already seen. Paul uses it in Galatians, and he uses it in a parallel reference in Romans. The other is not in Paul's letters at all. It's in Mark. Mark 14:36, and he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Just as Yeshua said, Abba, Father, Paul echoes those words here. Here in Mark, Yeshua's words imply more than just God is my Father. They inherently imply a closer, more intimate relationship. It's not uncommon in Jewish prayer and liturgy to see a corporate relationship, right? A plural relationship. In fact, we see in the prayer Avinu Malkeinu, right? Our Father, our King. What was a little bit less common was a personal statement. In fact, the only one that I could find was in Sirach, or the book of Ben Sira in the Apocrypha. There's a statement, God, you are my Father. Most Jewish prayers, they don't make it individualistic and personal. My Father. The point here, though, is that I believe Paul, by saying through the Ruach we cry out, Abba, Father, he means to imply our total adoption as heirs. Not just, well, God is Father, because every Roman household had a father. Even if you were a servant, the father of the household, right, was the head of the household. That was a common term. But that wasn't what he was getting at here. Not just, oh, well, there's a ruler over your household and he's called the Father. But he is your Father. You have a relationship because he has adopted you as a full covenant member into his family. Amen. Once again, Romans 8, verse 29. My Calvinists love this one, don't they? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. The firstborn among many what? Brothers and sisters, these are the children of God, adopted because of the work of Yeshua and the promise given to Abraham in the covenant. Right? The firstborn among many brothers and sisters. That's us. That's exciting, isn't it? Royalty. You get to be part of a royal family. We don't often think of that, do we? Except for my charismatic friends when they're claiming blessings and money. I like to be reminded, I am a child of God. Or a nifty Christian t-shirt. Daughter of the King. You ever seen those? Yeah. But how much do we actually think about what it means to be adopted into the royal family? It's a bit more impactful, I think, than we tend to think it is. But once again, the stress here is on covenant participation, being part of the family, having intimacy with God. Not that he is some distant relative, not that you're just some slave in the house and he's the homeowner that you're scared to even talk to when you come in from the fields after a long day of work. You have an intimate relationship. He is not just pater, he is Abba. And that is much more personal. The Spirit that dwells within us causes us to cry out to our Father. And we need to take that personally. Let's continue with verse 7. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, also an heir through God. This verse shows that we are not slaves, those who have no belongings, have no inheritance, but children, sons and daughters. And if children legally accepted in the eyes of God, then we are heirs. Right? Paul reiterates this as well, once again, in Romans 8. It's funny how Galatians 3-4 fits with Romans 8, doesn't it? All right, it's almost like he had a corporate entity in mind, like not an individualistic sort of thing, but like a whole national entity. That's enough making fun of my Reformed friends. Romans 8:15-17. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall again into fear. Rather, you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Ruach himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, also heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Messiah, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. And that suffer with him part, I think it's more into Romans than presently in Galatians, so I'm not going to cover that today. But I do actually have a teaching plan in the future about the term, I've mentioned it before, cruciformity. Right, living a cruciform life, being conformed to his image. Not just, oh, well, I get to be great and powerful and a member of the royal family, but being conformed to his image, even in suffering with him, as Paul says. Right? We've been crucified with him, he says elsewhere. The point of verse 7 should be clear. You are free. You're not a slave, right? You are a child of God. You are an heir to the promise because of your trust in God, not because of your own abilities to satisfy the requirements of the law and thereby obligate God to save you or to accept you. That's an important distinction to make, given where Paul's about to go in this letter. Verse 8. But at that time, when you did not know God, you served those who by nature are not gods at all. But now you have come to know God, or rather you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back again to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Verse 8 here again relates to the stoicheia that we previously looked at, the elemental spirits thought to control nature and the seasons. What Paul says here echoes what he says in Ephesians 2. Starting at verse 11, therefore keep in mind that once you, Gentiles in the flesh, called uncircumcision by those called circumcision, which is performed on flesh by hand, at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. We were far off, separated, excluded from the covenant people. Paul here speaks of Israel, specifically the politeia, commonwealth. I think it's better translated as citizenship, right? In fact, that's commonly how this word was used outside the New Testament. Citizenship. Not just that we were formerly cut off and not part of the people of Israel, but that we lacked kingdom citizenship. That is what is being expressed here. That is what being in covenant with God is. It is being granted kingdom citizenship. Amen. In the case of the passage here, and in Galatians, the enslavement to the powers of this world, the lack of connection with God and Israel as a covenant member, is being addressed. Paul follows this verse with one of his noonday phrases in Greek. Right? Noonday. But now, time to shift focus. But now, right, so back to Galatians 4:9. He says, but now you have come to know God, or rather, you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back again to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? The language here sounds like he's correcting himself, right? But now this, or rather, instead, right? Now, the rhetorician in Paul's day would often use this sort of language. Make a point, issue a retraction, followed by a stronger point to drive home what he was saying. Because, again, they didn't have exclamation points, right? And he's writing a letter, not speaking. He couldn't just speak louder. In the case here, the point he's driving home is that the Galatians were abandoning the truth that they had already experienced. Not only did they know God, again, early in chapter 3, we looked at how Paul knows they had true and real experiences. They'd already tasted it. They already knew God. They already had the Ruach. But they were also known by God. It was reciprocal. It was relational. He says here, not just, did you forget what you know? But more potently, did you forget that God knows you? Here again, Paul uses stoicheia. Right, and he offers a rebuke of turning back to those weak and worthless stoicheia. Again, some would here say that he refers to the Torah as though it were a rudimentary or elementary principle, a worthless thing to be thrown away. But we know our apostle better than that, don't we? Right, we know the man who says, I believe all that is written in the Torah and the prophets. Because Paul said that. We know the man who says the law is holy and the commandment is holy and just and good. We know the apostle who says the law is good if one uses it legitimately. No, Paul would not here call the Torah weak and worthless. Just as we saw in verse 8 with Paul's reference to the things they, Gentiles, formerly worshipped, these weak and worthless principles, better translated, I think, like the New Revised Standard and the Lexham English Bible, these weak and worthless elemental spirits. Paul refers to the Galatians' prior life of sorts, a time when they had not yet known or accepted the gospel, when they did not know God. At that time, they were slaves. They were not sons. Now, one could rightfully challenge and ask, why would Paul say the Galatians were going back to worshiping these elemental spirits if they were not being persuaded by pagans but by Jews? That's a fair question, right? And that's often how a theologian would respond to what we're saying here. Well, I understand that you're saying these weak and worthless things aren't the Torah, but it was, after all, these Judaizers coming in that were causing the problem to begin with, right? They were not being enticed to worship false gods and idols. They were being enticed to become Jews. Right? Isn't that the whole ordeal taking place here? So surely Paul is not saying that becoming Jewish is equal to worshiping idols or these false gods, these elemental spirits. No, he's not saying that. So why then would we say he is warning them against going back to paganism if the ones who are bringing in the issues to begin with aren't pagans? It's a very fair question, isn't it? Let's step back for a moment and consider something here. The elemental spirits, right, the stoicheia, includes the things under which all of mankind was enslaved prior to the regeneration of the gospel. Galatians 4:3 says as much, right? He says, so with us, while we were minors, again, we, us, right? This means Paul is not saying just you Gentiles had this problem. All mankind had this problem. Okay? So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. So whatever Paul has in mind here must be something that the Galatians had already turned from. They cannot be assumed to be the Torah, since the Galatians were Gauls. They were pagans by the very definition of the word. And as we have just seen, they were turning back to something they had previously left. Right? Verse 9 again. But now you have come to know God, or rather you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? How can you turn back? Paul asks. The word here is very clear. It doesn't mean simply to turn from one thing to another. He wasn't saying, why would you leave paganism to turn to Torah observance? That's not what he's saying. Right? The word he uses is very specific. It means to return or turn back to a prior state. John McKee has a very lengthy section in his Galatians commentary on this, but he cites Dr. Daniel Juster, suggesting that the Jews that were coming into Galatia, causing this problem to begin with, were of a mystical sect. Okay? He asserts that these Jews were promoting not only conversion to Judaism as a means of salvation, as we've seen exemplified in our entire study up to this point, but also a sort of mysticism that was likely the result of the Hellenization of Jewish practice and belief. Now, how can we infer this? Right? How do we come to such a convenient conclusion? Doesn't that really just iron everything out for us? It just solves all of our exegetical problems. Seems too convenient. I felt that way when I was first reading it. Well, consider that at the very beginning of this letter, Paul has already made a reference to this present evil age, right? Now, he makes that sort of reference as well as other references in other letters about the rulers of this age, the rulers of this world, and again, the elemental spirits of the world. Now there, in the beginning of his letter, he also said that even should an angel from heaven bring a different gospel, he is to be accursed. Why this comment about angels, if there wasn't some sort of belief making the rounds concerning angels and the knowledge they bring? Why this comment about even if an angel brings it, if there wasn't something going on that relates to? Now we could say, well, he was just throwing it in there for emphasis. Maybe. But I think he threw it in there for very specific purposes. In chapter 3, Paul says the Galatians had been bewitched. Do you remember that? We looked at that word and its connection to the belief in the evil eye, a superstitious belief about envy and the ability to harm someone by the way you look at them. A very common belief amongst even the Jews of the first century. Then here in chapter 4, he makes a couple references to the stoicheia, the elemental spirits. So McKee here infers that because of the various references to mystical practices, it is likely that the two issues are bound up together. On the one hand, the teachers coming in are teaching that covenant entrance depended on one's Jewishness. And in order to say that, you must clearly be Jewish yourself, right? Like you're not going to have a non-Jew coming in saying, well, I'm not accepted because I'm not Jewish, but you have to become Jewish to be accepted, right? Clearly, circumcision is tied up in this issue somehow, and we'll get to that once we get into the next chapter. So clearly, these were Jewish teachers. On the other hand, there must have been some level of mysticism present in order for these other references to make sense. Now, we've already noted in this teaching series the sectarian document from Qumran, right? 4QMMT, Miskat Ma'aseh HaTorah, or Concerning the Works of the Law, the document found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this may come as a surprise to people, are not only a number of amulets, but also texts containing spells and incantations. Do you know that? A lot of people didn't know that. Astrological works. Not only calendar, because everybody knows, the Qumran calendar, the Dead Sea calendar, there were multiple. That's one thing people also don't know. There were multiple different reckonings of the calendar found at Qumran. There were also astrological texts, attempts to divine the future by reading the stars, things that the Torah forbade. I know English good sometimes. Magic, sorcery, and mysticism. And we can ask that question, if the group that was so heavily trying to influence the Galatians was related, at least in some way, to these Qumranic Jews or a similar sect, these references to the works of the law, these references to keeping certain commandments to identify as a Jewish identity, to become a Jew in order to be accepted by the community, and these references to superstitious beliefs, now suddenly these make all more sense. Whether simply because they themselves had been influenced or whatever their relation may be, at the very least, we can say the similarities are striking. One more thing that I mentioned a few moments ago, we can circle back to now. Verses 9 and 10. But now you have come to know God, or rather you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back to those weak and worthless principles? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. Verse 10 here has most often been taken as a reference to the Moedim, the appointed times, the feast days, right? In fact, you just about can't read this passage and not think of the Moedim when you read it, right? If you're Messianic, that's just where your mind goes. You see days, seasons, years. You think creation, when he created the luminaries to determine these things. And you think the appointed times. But it's not a reference to that. It has been noted that the exact phrase Paul uses here, days and months and seasons and years, does not exist in Jewish or Christian writings of the first century in reference to the feast days. This exact phrase is not common vocabulary. Now, many would argue, close enough, right? It's close enough. I don't think so. After he has already made two mentions to the stoicheia, the elemental spirits of the world, the entities believed to control the seasons, and also, we must note, including the luminaries. Right, the stoicheia were included as the luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars, according to Second Temple Jewish works. Only then does Paul turn to a phrase that describes observance of days and months and seasons and years. This sounds more like a reference to mystical and magical practices like astrology than it does to the Moedim when you frame it this way. It would also be more fitting to the context of what the Galatians would be turning back to. It wasn't uncommon for pagan peoples to observe lucky and unlucky days. Right? An unlucky day for traveling, for example, would then restrict a person's travel if they believed something evil would befall them if they went on a journey that day. If we were to read this as a reference to the Moedim, we would be faced with too many issues. First, at what point did the Galatians possess and observe God's calendar prior to their encounter with the gospel? When were they already doing these days and seasons, right? We have no evidence that suggests they did in any way. And second, what in the immediate context suggests that Paul's reference to observing days and months and seasons and years is a reference to God's calendar and to the exclusion of pagan observances? Nothing. Here's another thing to consider. If you're still chewing on the possibility that there's some form of Jewish mysticism in mind here, some of you will be skeptical by nature, and that's good. I am too, right? I like that. It's part of what makes it hard to teach sometimes because I want to explain everything and give you all the different possibilities and all the different methods of interpretation and approaches. It also tends to confuse people, though. So let's talk about an extra biblical book here for a moment and how it relates to this topic. You ever heard of this one? Wisdom of Solomon. You ever heard of that? This book is a Greek work found in some copies of the Septuagint. In fact, it is part of the standard Apocrypha. If you have a New Revised Standard Bible, it's like a Catholic version that has the Apocrypha in it. That book's in there. It was written just before the New Testament, likely around the turn of the centuries. Scholars have provided various guesses, and they say the most probable range is between 220 BC to AD 50. That's a wide range, isn't it? But we know it fits in the Second Temple era. And while that is quite a range, we can at the very least say that this book and the material in it were known in Paul's day. Now, this book is pseudepigraphical, right? Falsely ascribed, falsely named. It bears Solomon's name. Solomon didn't write it. Okay? It was most likely written by a Hellenistic Jew, someone not far outside the realm in which we find Philo of Alexandria. We can tell this because the author is not only very familiar with Greek poetry and philosophy, he also largely employs it In fact, one of the things that makes wisdom as a book, Wisdom of Solomon, stand out is because it attempts to explain the Tanakh within the framework of Greek philosophy. Given the author's extensive knowledge of the Torah and his interpretation of it, it is clear that he was Jewish. Now, for many, this has led to the conclusion that the author was an Alexandrian Jew. In fact, some have even floated the theory that Philo himself wrote it. I don't know that I believe that, but that's one of the ideas. The Book of Wisdom, as it is also called, is a fascinating read, and I encourage you to read it just remembering it for what it is, and that's not Scripture. Okay? It's a book produced by an Alexandrian or other Hellenistic Jew who used the Greek language, philosophy, and poetry to explain his biblical heritage. Now, what does it have to do with Galatians? Right? If you're not already asking that, you should be. And that's fair. So for one, the Book of Wisdom is actually quoted and or alluded to multiple times in the New Testament. Do you know that? Even the Gospels quote this book. Yeah. Now, if you remember from the Foundations series, we looked at a number of quotations in the New Testament in the teaching that I did on Scripture. Right? What is Scripture? Why do we have the books that we have? Why don't we have these other ones? And so on. We looked at a number of quotes in Scripture from books that are not in the Bible, including Paul quoting from pagan philosophers. Just because something was quoted is not the only qualifier for whether or not it needs to be considered Scripture. My point is, this book was well known, and it provides some interesting insight into our topic at hand. Here's a few verses for you. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 15. May God grant me, and of course the author here speaks from the perspective of Solomon, right? He claims to be Solomon expressing his own teaching, expressing his own wisdom. He says, may God grant me to speak with judgment and to have thoughts worthy of what I have received, for he is the guide even of wisdom and the corrector of the wise. It sounds kind of like Proverbs, right? Corrector of the wise. For both we and our words are in his hand, as are all understanding and skill in crafts. For it is he who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists. Can you imagine making that claim? I have unerring knowledge. That sounds quite boastful, doesn't it? That's almost as like Moses writing Moses was the most humble man. I don't think you're allowed to say that. Verse 17, for it is he who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, the beginning and end of middle times, the alternations of the solstices, the changings of the seasons. See that? The activity of the elements, that's the stoicheia. Same word. This he follows up with a statement about the beginning and end and middle of times, alternations of solstices, the changes of the seasons. Very clearly here, this Hellenistic Jewish author connects the stoicheia with the observance of days and seasons and so on. Let's continue. Verse 19, the cycles of the year and the constellations of the stars, the natures of animals and the tempers of wild animals, the powers of spirits and the thoughts of human beings, the varieties of plants and the virtues of roots. The cycles of the year and constellations, the powers of spirits, and more. The author here very clearly articulates these things are all connected. Of course, he says that they are all connected by wisdom and the fact that he possesses it. So what if... Let me put this out here for you. What if these things are connected not only by this lone author, he's not the only one claiming this, right? You wouldn't spend all this time to write a book and make copies of it if you were the only person saying this. What if this was also a common belief? What if much of the material of this apocryphal book suits the Hellenistic Jewish thought that we see in Philo, for example? Because it does. A lot. A lot. What if these ideas are linked in Galatians because Paul knew these Jewish teachers were not only teaching a perverted gospel, but also teaching a perverted sense of wisdom and knowledge? It would make sense then why Paul would draw on these same terms and themes. In his mind, the Galatians were being led away from the gospel by thinking they needed to become proselytes to convert to Judaism in order to be saved. Additionally, they were in danger of turning back to the worship of the elements, the forces of nature that by nature, an ironic term by Paul, are not gods at all. Turning back to these elemental things, the things they had previously worshipped, not the appointed times, not the Torah. They didn't previously have those anyway. Okay? I think this best accords with the context here. I think it best accords with what we see Paul addressing and all of his statements together. Now let's read verse 11, and then I want to offer sort of a brief summary. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. The word Paul uses here for labored implies strenuous work, hard, harsh toil. Okay, in his ministering to the Galatians, Paul had not just planted a few seeds and moved on. He had worked, he had labored hard for them. And what is it that he feared may have been in vain? What were they doing? It brings us back to the point of the letter. They were being led astray. They were leaving behind their trust in God in favor of a trust in their own law-keeping efforts to save them. Now, really quick now, I want to offer sort of a thematic summary of chapter 4 up to this point. I considered doing this next week, but I think it'll be beneficial to do it today. First, let's reread verses 1 through 11, because I think having it all here makes it make more sense. Verse 1, now I am saying, so long as the heir is underage, he is no different from a slave, even though he is the owner of everything. Instead, he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also, when we were underage, we were subservient to the basic principles, the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent out his Son, born of a woman and born under law, to free those under law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Now, because you are sons, God sent the Ruach into our hearts, the Ruach of his Son into our hearts, who cries out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, also an heir through God. But at that time, when you did not know God, you served those who by nature are not gods at all. Now you have come to know God, or rather, you have come to be known by God. So how can you turn back again to those weak and worthless elemental spirits? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Hopefully you can read that on the screen. If not, hopefully you have your Bibles handy. So Paul, in this section of his letter, he is speaking of the second Exodus. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? What? Until we come to maturity, we are slaves. Okay? That's verses 1 and 2. We are enslaved to the elemental spirits, right? These basic principles of the present world. In a sense, under guardians and managers. It's like spiritual Egypt, like Israel and Egypt locked up in bondage with taskmasters appointed over them. Then when the fullness of time comes, God sends his Son to redeem us. This means to buy our freedom, to bring us out of slavery. We know that the slavery to which we were in bondage was sin. This freedom in the first Exodus was being led out of Egypt with signs and wonders. God freed Israel from slavery, right? After being freed, being redeemed, we were adopted by God into his family. This is reminiscent of the covenant. God decided to take the people as his own. Exodus 6:7, I will take you to myself as a people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. After being freed, after being redeemed, they were given the Torah. Now, how can the Torah be the bondage and slavery that God gave you right after bringing you out of bondage and slavery? That's illogical. It would make no sense. In the Torah, he tells them about the blessings for obedience, but he also relates the curses for disobedience, resulting in death, and the spiritual penalty as well as the national penalty of exile. Now, the people were eventually led into the land after 40 years of issues. And just as was prophesied, their disobedience led to exile. The yearning for the return from exile, for the reestablishment of the kingdom of Israel, cannot be stripped away from the context of first century Judaism. Even the apostles, after spending years with Yeshua, learning directly from him just before his ascension, still asked, are you now restoring the kingdom to Israel? Returning to Egypt, as many Israelites in the wilderness had longed for, would be a return to the former things, a return to slavery. Paul speaks to the Galatians, warning them not to return. Not that he's telling them, don't turn to Torah observance, but to the observance of the elemental things, to the observance of spiritual entities and powers, not unlike the Gnostics that would soon rise up in early Christian communities. This was their slavery. This was their Egypt. This is what he warns them not to do. Don't get so far here and die in the wilderness because you wanted to go back to Egypt. Now, I have one important point to press here. Important point to press. It's not something new, right? It's not something that we haven't already looked at, especially in this series. But what I really want to drive home is based on the background and the context of today's reading. So we looked once again at the stoicheia, right? The elemental spirits, the reference to elements of nature and the luminaries, the sun and moon and stars, the observance of days, not of the Moedim, not of the appointed times of Adonai, but the superstitious and astrological observances of the pagan world. In all of this, we noted how it is likely, and I would say must be, given the combined evidence, that the influences brought into the Galatian community were those that had mixed this Greek paganism into Judaism. So here's what I want you to take from this. Knowledge for knowledge's sake doesn't change your heart. Okay? In this movement, there are a lot of smart people. I know many Torah observant people that are very highly educated, formally in universities and seminaries, as well as independently on their own. People that could, and hopefully will, write books that would blow your mind. Incredible insights. And there are even more people who fancy themselves as smart and are greatly deceived. In either case, knowledge for knowledge's sake doesn't enfleshen your heart, and it doesn't reform your behavior. A lot of people in this walk have been duped into believing that the one with the most knowledge, or worse, the one with the most esoteric opinions, is a sign of having the most righteousness. But the beginning of wisdom is not found in predicting the future. It's not found in predicting the future for lucky days that are good for travel, when to stay home and not travel, when to invest in Bitcoin. It's not found in predicting the future of the return of Messiah. The beginning of wisdom is found as explained by the psalmist. The fear of Adonai is the beginning of wisdom. All who follow his precepts have good understanding. His praise endures forever. Amen.